Hey, greetings everybody, GleeCon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we read Chapter 5 of the novella by Chris Metzen, Warcraft War, I guess, father. It's called Of Blood and Honor, and in that one, Tyrion was brought on trial in Stratholme before a representative, mostly paladins, but a couple other people like Alonsus Fowl and Arthas. Well, I guess that's still a paladin at this point. And he basically pled guilty to treason. He said it was a matter of honor, and they have excommunicated him. But as a sign of mercy, they let his family, if they want, they can stay. So stay a while and listen. It's called A Sword of Homecoming. This is Chapter 6 of A Blood and Honor, and I'm going to guess. This is him because they said he could go back home and collect this stuff. I'm going to guess he's going to go back home, collect this stuff, and have a kind of a parting farewell to his family. I think his son's too young to do anything, to make any kind of decisions or express any emotion, and I think based on the way they portrayed the wife briefly that she's going to be like, screw you, Jack. All right, let's see. It was twilight as the tired envoy made its way back to Martenhold Keep. It had begun to rain during the afternoon, and the weary horses scared the crap out of me. It had begun to rain during the afternoon, and the weary horses trudged their way down the muddy road. Arden, leading the somber column of knights and footmen, looked back at Tyrion worriedly. Tyrion was slumped over in his saddle, heedless of what transpired around him. His broad shoulders drooped weakly, and his head was bowed in grief. The ceaseless rain ran in rivulets down his haggard face. Arden's heart broke, seeing his former lord and master in such a state. He was forced to look away. Looking toward the keep, the captain saw that Tyrion's advisors had gathered at the main gate to greet their returning lord. Tyrion's stomach was tied in knots. He was blocked from the light. In the 30 years that he had served as a paladin, he never dreamed that the blessed power would be stripped from him. He felt absolutely hollow inside. Wallowing in despair and misery, he was unable to even lift his eyes toward the site of his former home. Arden rode slowly up to the gate and dismounted. The advisors, at seeing Tyrion's near comatose state, asked the captain what was wrong. Sorry, that's a voicemail coming through. Probably spam. Arden grimaced. There have been some changes, he said to them curtly. The advisors looked at each other in confusion. What do you mean, Captain? Where have you both been these past few days? What was wrong for our lord? One of them asked heatedly. Arden bowed his head in shame and sorrow. Our Lord Tyrion has been found guilty of treason against the Alliance, he said with a heavy heart. The High Court has ordered that he be exiled from our lands. The advisors gasped in shock. Surely you must be mistaken. That's impossible, one of the advisors said shakily. He looked into Arden's eyes and saw that it clearly was not. It can't be, the advisor said blankly. Arden nodded grimly and helped Tyrion dismount from his horse. But who is our lord now, Arden? Who will rule over Hearthglen? Another advisor asked. Arden shook his head and scoffed as he answered, Bartholus would be your new lord for the time being. It did sound like a bad joke, he thought to himself. He put his arm around Tyrion and started to lead him inside. I want the guards to stay alert tonight. Tyrion is to remain here under house arrest. At first light, I will take a party of footmen and escort him to the border. Till then, neither of us is to be disturbed. Is that clear? The captain asked in a gravelly voice. The shocked advisors merely nodded their assent. Arden dragged Tyrion in out of the rain and ushered him toward his private chambers, hoping that he wouldn't have to face Karondra before morning. Not for the first time he wondered if there was anything that he could have done to prevent this all from happening. Arden leaned Tyrion against wall. Yeah, it's a typo. Arden leaned Tyrion against the wall outside his private chambers and opened the door. Thanks for your help, Arden. This has been very difficult. I just wanted you to know that you've been a good friend to me. I'm sorry all this has happened, the former paladin said. Arden nodded and turned away slowly. If there's anything you need, let me know, the captain said as he left. Tyrion watched him leave and found just enough strength to close the door behind him and collapse in a chair. Overcome with emotion, he buried his face in his hands. His limbs would not stop shaking, and the gnawing emptiness in his gut threatened to devour what was left of his soul. He couldn't face his wife and tell her what he'd done. Ironically, after all the years he'd refused to lie to her, he now found that he couldn't bear to tell her the truth. The adjoining door to Talon's room opened, and Karondra stepped out quietly, shutting it behind her. She looked surprised to see Tyrion sitting there in the dark. "Tyrion, what has happened?" she asked urgently. She lit a decorative lantern, and its soft light bathed the room. Shadows danced across the walls as she knelt down beside her husband. "Where have you been? I've been worried sick." "I accompanied Lord Datherhan back to Strathel," he muttered, his head still bowed. "You know, Tyrion, you've been sneaking off quite a bit lately. If I didn't know you any better, I'd assume that you were seeking comfort from another woman," she said teasingly. Tyrion raised his head and looked at her. Seeing the deadened look in his eyes, she knew that he was not amused in the least. "Tyrion, darling, what's wrong? Has something happened to you?" she asked worriedly. He looked over toward Talon's room. "Is the boy asleep?" he asked quietly. Karondra frowned and answered that he was. "I don't quite know how to tell you this, my love," he began somberly. "But I've been branded a traitor and stripped of my titles." Her eyes widened in shock. He wasn't joking, she realized. In fact, as she looked at him more closely, she marveled at how defeated and deflated he seemed. In all the years she had known him, he had never looked this way. It frightened her immensely. She shook her head, unable to grasp the enormity of the situation. "How could this happen, Tyrion? What have you done?" she asked in a strangled voice. He closed his eyes and held his breath for a moment, attempting to calm the furious pounding of his heart. "You remember the secret that I kept from you?" he asked. She nodded as her brow creased in anxiety. "The orc I fought with saved my life, Karondra. If not for him, I would have been crushed under a collapsing tower. To repay him for saving me, I vowed on my honor to keep his existence secret." Karondra covered her face. She shook her head as if she didn't want to hear any more, but Tyrion continued anyway. "I was forced to hunt the orc down under direct orders, but when it came time to capture him, my conscience overtook me. To uphold my honor, I fought to free it. I was arrested on the spot and taken to Stratham for trial," he finished. They sat there in silence for many long moments. Karondra sniffed and wiped tears from her eyes. "I can't even begin to imagine what you were thinking," she said breathlessly. "The orc is a beast, Tyrion. It has no concept of honor. You gambled all our lives on a stupid, silly whim," she spat, careful to keep her voice down. She didn't want to wake Talon and let him see his father in such a state. Tyrion simply sat with his head bowed. For some strange reason, seeing him in such a weakened state only made her more anxious. "So what happens to us now, Tyrion? Did you even consider that while you were playing the martyr?" she said softly, disappointment rampant in her voice. He stood and walked over to the window. Night had settled heavily over the fields beyond the keep. The rain continued to pour as if nature was attempting to rid itself of some foulness in the world. "I've been exiled, Karondra. I'm to be escorted to the boiler at first light," he said gravely. She blinked in shock. "Exiled?" she whispered. "Light, damn you, Tyrion. I told you your precious honor would be the end of us." He turned to face her. "Without honor, woman, everything we have is meaningless," he said, motioning around at their lavish surroundings. She waved her arm dismissively. "Will your honor keep us fed and keep our son decently clothed? How can you maintain this senseless obsession in the face of what's happened? What happened to the responsible man I married?" she asked. He gritted his teeth and turned to face her. "I've always been this way, Karondra. Don't talk to me as if it's any surprise. You knew that marrying a paladin would demand certain sacrifices. And I've made plenty of them, willingly. I held my tongue every time you rode off to battle. I sat here alone for countless hours, waiting to hear if you were alive or dead. Do you have any idea of what that was like for me? I never complained once all those times that you left us for your bureaucratic duties. I knew you had a job to do. I knew people counted on you. But I counted on you too, damn it. I kept it all inside so that you could do your duty with honor. I know all about sacrifices, Tyrion.
but this time the price is too high."
"What do you mean by that?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. She held him in her fiery stare.
"I love you, Tyrion. Please believe that, but I won't be coming with you, and neither will Talon,"
she said softly. Karondra turned away, unable to look him in the eye.
"I will not have our son grow up as an outcast or be the subject of ridicule for the rest of his life. He doesn't deserve that, Tyrion, and neither do I," she said.
Tyrion felt as if his life no longer had any meaning. Losing the light was devastating enough. He didn't know if he could bear losing her, too. His head spun.
"I understand how you must feel, Karondra. Believe me, I do,"
he barely managed to say.
"You said this is what you want. You've ruined your life. I will not simply hold on while you plummet to the bottom and ruin ours as well," she said almost frantically.
She hugged herself, trying to calm her raw nerves.
"I hope your precious honor keeps you warm at night," she said.
"Karondra, wait," Tyrion said as she left. She walked swiftly toward her room and slammed the door shut behind her. Tyrion heard the bolt lock and the faint sounds of her sobbing. Unable to comfort her, Tyrion leaned his head against the window's cool pane of glass. Absently, he watched as the raindrops splattered against the pane. He knew her well enough to know that she would not change her mind. He had lost nearly everything he had ever cared for. The only thing he had left in the world was his honor. He wasn't even sure of that anymore. It's tough. It's definitely a moral quandary, especially as a father. I feel like everything else, but being a father really throws that moral philosophy, those dilemmas, like a dilemma into the works there. As if in a daze, Tyrion walked into his reading room and sat down at his large polished oak desk. He lit a few candles and gathered up a piece of parchment, ink, and new quill. Without really knowing exactly what he wanted to say, he started scribbling down his thoughts on the parchment. His hand shook as he wrote, smearing the ink in spots. He emptied his heart out onto the parchment, expressing everything he felt, explaining everything he had done. He sat at the desk and wrote, late into the night. Morning was only an hour off when Tyrion entered Daelin's darkened room. Karondra had cried herself to sleep hours before, so Tyrion knew he would be undisturbed. He walked over to where his son lay, sleeping peacefully. Snuggled in his blankets, the boy breathed steadily. Tyrion watched him sleep for a while, awed by the child's innocence and purity. He knew his son deserved better than a life of forced exile. He deserved all of the good things life had to offer. With a shaky hand, Tyrion reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the rolled parchment he had written. Tears filled his eyes as he carefully placed the note under his son's pillow. Perhaps someday the boy might understand what I've done, he hoped. Perhaps somehow he'll look back on me and be proud. Tyrion patted the boy's head and kissed him on the cheek. Goodbye, my son, he said, fighting back his tears. Be good. With that, he quietly left and closed the door behind him. Dawn had broken over the tranquil fields of Hearthglen. The oppressive storm clouds had blown away, and the sky was bright and crystal clear. In a few hours, the old orc Aetrigg would be hanged in Stratholme. Tyrion had decided that he would not let that happen. Whatever else transpired, Aetrigg would not die. He had little trouble bypassing the keep's lax guardsmen and reaching the stables. As quietly as he could, he saddled Mirador and prepared his meager supplies for the journey to Stratholme. He placed his foot in the stirrup and hauled himself up onto his horse.
This is the second time I've caught you trying to sneak off, Tyrion,
Arden said, standing in the entranceway. Tyrion's heart froze. He looked around and saw that there were no guards with the captain. In fact, there was no escort party anywhere to be seen.
I figured you'd try something like this,
the captain said. Tyrion gripped his reins tightly and cleared his throat.
Are you here to stop me, Arden?
He asked tightly. The captain walked over and tightened the straps of Mirador's saddlebags.
Even if I had a mind to, I doubt that I could, Arden replied honestly. I sat up all night thinking about what you said at the trial. I think perhaps I understand how you felt. You were only doing what you thought was right. You always have. For that I cannot condemn you.
Tyrion nodded and leaned down. He placed his hand on Arden's shoulder.
I need to ask you a favor, old friend. It's the most important thing I have ever asked of you, he said breathlessly.
Arden looked up at him gravely.
Whatever is in my power to do, I will do, the captain said. Watch over them for me, Arden. Keep my boys safe,
Tyrion said. Arden reached up and took hold of his friend's hand.
I will,
was all he could say. Satisfied, Tyrion nodded to Arden and looked out toward the distant tree line. He dug his spurs into Mirador's sides and thundered out of the stables. Strathholm was only a few hours away. If he rode like the wind, he would make it in time to stop the hanging. He charged down the path at breakneck speed, pushing the faithful Mirador faster and harder than he ever had before. Yeah, that's a bummer. I mean, they kind of portrayed the wife in the few moments as being, I don't know how you would describe it. I mean, you got to take it also with a grain of salt. Like, in a moment she's seeing, you'd feel betrayed. You'd feel like your spouse made this decision that went to upend your whole life. But at that moment, you have to, you're making a decision between supporting your spouse and your wife at the cost of everything you hold dear and a quality of life for your own child. I don't know. I know as far as my own life, my own marriage, I've been with my wife a long time, longer than it sounds like these two are together. So I think it's a little different because I would trust my wife like I would hope she would trust me, and we would just make it work. But yeah, it's unfortunate. I think kids are resilient too. Like the kid's gonna be fine, way more fine than he would be for not having a dad. And I think that's what sucks there, because now the kid instead is going to look back and see my dad made a decision that led to him not being with me, but there was an opportunity. That's not. It's the dad's fault majorly, but the mom also played a role in that. Like it didn't have to be. He didn't have to lose the dad over this, but yeah, it's rough. Don't even say goodbye to your kid either. Rough, man. Rough. Yeah. And it makes the mother character a little bit. I'm sure there are jerks out there like that. Because I mean, really, she just comes off like a complete jerk. Not a good partner. But it makes you also feel like Metzen here doesn't have the best view of women. I mean, sure, from a literary device, he had to write his character that way. But then you also look at the things he's gone on record saying about being completely oblivious, essentially, to the culture of extreme sexist abuse going on in Blizzard. And then, I could be totally making a mountain out of a molehill or reading all into this and creating my own scarecrows. And but yeah, it just doesn't. It's not a good look. All right, cool. We got another episode in 5 by 5. We're 3/4 of the way done. We got a couple more to go. Sorry for getting all heavy and dark. That was just a sort of a sad moment, and sometimes I get my feels a little bit when I'm reading these stories. Thanks everyone for watching and listening. I look forward to seeing y'all next time on Lore of Warcraft.